So what I really want to talk today about is the importance of understanding how governance operates as a corporate executive. And we'll talk a little bit about what you need to know as a corporate executive if you are already on a board or looking to become part of a board, or even if you're just staying as an executive manager and you're looking to support the board. So we'll try and cover as much of the basics as we can about why governance is so important and how you can implement it, use it, learn from it, and hopefully improve your performance in your roles, whatever they may be. So just as a brief intro, if I can get my slides to change. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, so I know quite a few of you have come in through an affiliate and from LinkedIn, so welcome. So we provide integrated board solutions. We do guide, which is guiding the board, and it's an ongoing retainer-based service, very much like company secretarial, but a lot more involved, a lot more engaged, a lot more about trying to improve the board's performance rather than just taking the minutes. Appoint is about appointing non-exec directors, and it's very difficult often to find truly independent directors. So that's our speciality, helping and supporting companies to find independent directors that are properly qualified with good experience, etc., etc. And then educate. So this forms part of what we do in the education space. So educating the market in why governance is so important, but also running courses, which we'll talk a little bit about at the very end if you're interested, just to give you some highlights on what kinds of education programs we're running. And our target market is Africa, continental Africa. So we have clients all over this continent. And we partner with boards to navigate their unique journey of improved boardroom performance. So that's what we're aiming for, improved boardroom performance, wherever you come from. So what I want to do is a little bit of an overview of why governance is so important. So a few horror stories in the corporate space. I think it's really important to understand the difference between the concept of craft and enterprise, because even though it's very much an entrepreneurial thing and about the way the businesses are constructed, it still has relevance in terms of mindset when you're in a larger business. So it's important to understand the distinction. Then we'll go into what is very much a part of corporate, which is the difference between shareholders, directors, and managers, and those different responsibilities. And digging more into the specifics of director roles and responsibilities. Very brief introduction to ISO 37000. There's a lot more information out there. Jenny, at some point when we get there, will post a link to a webinar that one of my colleagues ran in November, and we've also got a training course coming up in May. And then just to close out, we'll be going through the 8 strategic areas that we believe a board should be looking at, and also how that links to ISO 37000. So that's basically the program for the day. So Jenny, if you can just please put the poll up of who's in the room, because I'd be really interested to see how many of you are from an entrepreneurial business. So in other words, you're a shareholder manager, you're a consultant possibly, consulting to corporates. But I'm really interested to find out who on this call is actually working for a corporate, is actually an executive director. Those of you who are non-exec directors, tick that box as well, because obviously all of this still applies to you. And if you're an aspiring non-exec director, whether in corporate or in a private business, then this is really about the kinds of things you need to know, the training you need to actually actively be involved in if you really want to move into that space. Great, so we have 5 shareholder managers. Good cross-section, fabulous. Just give it a couple more seconds. I think there's 4 or 5 of you haven't ticked it. Just quickly tick the box, and then we can move on. Thank you. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, just end the poll there, Jenny. Thanks. And you can share the results so everyone else can see. So we had a good spread of work for a corporate, 30%, executive directors, 39%. I'm assuming there's a lot of crossover in those two, and a few non-exec directors, which is great. And a couple of entrepreneurs, consultants and shareholder managers. Fabulous. Good. So let's move on. If you can just stop sharing. So there's been some horrible governance failures, as if anybody who's read the newspaper, seen the news on the TV, whatever they might have done to expose themselves to that, you'll know all about the horrible things that have happened. So in the past, we had master bonds, CNA struggled, LeisureNet was a big disaster, had to be taken over by Virgin Active because they had all kinds of accounting and revenue and various other cash flow problems that destroyed them. We've had all kinds of problems with state-owned enterprises. I'm not going to go into those in detail. So state-owned companies, SABC, the entire board's resigned more than once. SAA has been a complete disaster. Eskom is still struggling with getting the right people on the board and the right people in the organization. And a lot of that has been due to governance issues in the past. And Telkom and Transnet have also obviously struggling. So one of the things, as I said, I'm not going to dive into state-owned companies specifically, but one of the biggest problems which we will talk about when we get into the three hats, which shows up all the time in state-owned enterprises, is that there is not that split between the shareholders and management. So what happens is the shareholders meddle with management and they completely leapfrog the board, which totally disempowers them. And lo and behold, they resign because they feel like they have got no way of actually holding the CEO accountable or even implementing the strategic things that they've come up with into the rest of the organization, because the shareholder keeps wading in and changing the direction. We've also Tonga Hewlett, who overstated their results. So we'll talk a lot about the sort of why things fail. VBS, looting of more than 2 billion probably. I don't know if they've finished calculating the numbers. Steinhoff, they don't even know exactly what the situation is. They're still investigating. We've got some consequences so far with fines, but still US still isn't in jail, although it might end up in jail in Germany. But there's been fines and there's been some understanding of how much share value has been wiped out. 216 billion at the last count, which is massive, but it's not over yet. And the scary thing is that the consequences really aren't being felt by those involved. And then there's a whole list of others: KPMG, McKinsey, SAP, all of the ones that were linked in with the Guptas, but also LinkedIn just generally, that was part of their process, was rather unethical and definitely not following good governance practice. And the same for overseas. So one of the big learnings from the big ones that happened internationally, Enron, was massive accounting fraud. So hiding things in special purpose vehicles, obscuring the truth. Parmalat, lack of independence. So good example of board members who were family and friends of the majority shareholder, nepotism, son and daughter, moving funds out of the business. So that when the whole thing fell apart, the money'd already gone. Accounting fraud, double billing schemes. That happens so often. We pump the revenue because there's so much pressure to show good numbers, particularly if you're in the public eye. Volkswagen, lack of independence as well. Completely dominated, board was completely dominated by one family and one individual. So Ferdinand Peak, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. His wife was there. I think she was a nursery school teacher. Nothing wrong with nursery school teachers, but didn't demonstrate much in terms of skills and training for being a director, and lots of long-time friends. So they went along with what he said, and a very autocratic leader. So he managed to convince them to push aside these risks of finding out about the diesel emissions, etc. So that's a total lack of accountability. So this is real. This is massive in terms of value destruction, in terms of job destruction, etc., etc. So that's why we want to avoid it, because if it goes wrong, and it goes badly wrong. And from this is financialdirector.co.uk, good quote: one of the most obvious reasons for corporate failure is the lack of an effective board. So where does that start from? It starts from making sure you have effective directors, and then you have an effective board process so that the board as a whole can be effective and do what it needs to do. And there's, as I said, there are plenty of warning signs to indicate when the boards are in over their heads. Skills limitations. So we'll talk a little bit about what you need to know from a skills perspective. Absence of experience in core business areas. It's really key that as a director on a large company, you have experience across a broad range of the business areas. You can't rely on so-and-so to tell you the financials without being able to read an income statement and balance sheet yourself. You can't rely on the other executives to give you an in-depth understanding of how the business operates. You need to learn and understand how HR, marketing, all of those divisions work. fundamentally, because you're going to be talking about making the strategic decisions which will affect those, and holding senior executives to account. So one of the biggest single problems with state-owned enterprises is how do you hold the senior executives to account when they were appointed by the shareholder and the shareholder decides whether they stay or they go. So warning signs, this was from IT Governance Journal, promotion of the nepotism, corruption and incompetent leadership. So we've seen that in some of the examples we touched on earlier. Lack of financial resource, so a big problem is not having sufficient cash. And if you don't have sufficient cash, then there's a tendency, if there isn't a proper governance framework in place, to start hiding those debts, converting them to equity, putting them into shell companies, all of those kind of things. And then the problem just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you can't deal with it without major catastrophe. So board of directors that lacks the knowledge to make informed decisions. So it's really important as directors, we have the skills, we have the knowledge, we have the understanding, we've done the training. Controlled by one individual. How often does that happen? Happens in departments, happens in divisions, happens in even large organizations where one very vocal, very charismatic, very authoritarian leader dominates the conversation. They don't really give space for people to give them feedback and say, look, I think we're going in the wrong direction. And then adequately qualified members who do not have appropriate qualification or experience to analyze key business transactions. So have you got sufficient skills in the board or involved with the board process to analyze your financials in detail, to dig into those potential tax frauds that are happening, dig into those potential issues with lots of different subsidiaries going on doing their own thing. And definitely anyone in the board needs to have a much better understanding of financial results so they can hold analysts, auditors and regulators and report to regulators. So craft versus enterprise. Look, typically we think about the small food stand versus the McDonald's, a large enterprise, and that is the key distinction. But what I really want to get more into is the understanding of how this operates as a mindset. So there can tend to be a mindset, even in a department of a large organization, where there's an intense focus on the skill and the ability of that team leader, of that department leader, and they haven't really made the transition from being a very skilled technician, and maybe they shouldn't have even been put in the position to have to make that transition, of being from a really skilled technician to being a manager and a leader. So that look out for it in your departments, look out for it in your organizations, and be aware that it's not ideal. We need to start thinking much more about how do we get people in the right place and properly rewarded for doing what they're really good at. So if they are a really good technician, then we want to try and make sure that they have the space and ability and the remuneration to reward them for being the best technician they can be, and not move them into leadership positions where they will tend to have that sort of craft mindset, and they will tend to cover things up. They might be a bit autocratic because they think that if they tell everybody what to do, that that's the way to do it, that's the way to manage. They're not necessarily prepared to listen to people giving them advice. They hold on to the power because there's that, feeling of not being good enough. It happens a lot in entrepreneurship, but it also happens in larger organizations as well. That if I help and support someone else to do what I do, then I'm going to be out of a job. Instead of I'm going to have the capacity and the position to move up through the organization. So what is that succession plan through the divisions to try and avoid people holding on to their power, being autocratic, making sure that the operations can't work without them because they know everything, they've kept everything in their head. My way or the highway, we've all heard that. Protects the skills and IP, particularly problem in IT departments where they protect their knowledge and they don't want to train anyone else properly in case they take over that role and take over their position and they lose their job or they fail to get the next promotion. And builds a team below them, not alongside them. So this is really important when you're trying to build a bigger organization, but the same applies throughout the different layers of a larger organization as well. We want to make sure that we building a team. An enterprise is about a team. It's not about the individual. so wants to be seen as the expert. Classic example of thinking with a craft mindset. So we want a big organization. We're operating with teams, whether it's a factory, whether it's an office, whether it's whatever it looks like and feels like. We need to make sure that we've got teams operating at the best level they can, being led by people who are good leaders, and then that flows up through the organization. But it needs to start from the top, as we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. So what is the difference and why a corporate is so important in terms of this space? They can operate without the founder. They have a significant value, so people want to invest in the bigger companies because they have a significant value. They have some kind of legacy, they have some kind of track record, they've proven their market, but we need to keep that going. We need to make sure that we don't get stuck in the compliance and all of the other stuff, the processes and procedures, and we need to keep that innovation. We need to keep making sure that the departments are led by leaders who can take the department forward and add value rather than just holding on tight to what they had already. And most importantly, the difference between an enterprise and another smaller business is it requires shareholders, directors, and managers. When you first register a Pty Limited, when you first register an Inc. or a Limited, you have to define who the shareholders, directors, and managers are. So we need to understand how that works, what the roles and responsibilities are, regardless of what business we're involved in. So that's when it comes to the three hats. So one of the things I think often we don't know, and it's worth finding out because it's really important to understand what they want. We don't know who necessarily the shareholders are, particularly if we're in a division of an organization that is a subset of some parent company in the UK or the US. There may be multiple layers before you get to the little office in South Africa or Ghana or Rwanda or Zimbabwe, wherever it might be located. It's important to understand who the ultimate shareholders are because you need to understand what they want, what do they see as value, but also all of the other stakeholders because of the stakeholder inclusivity. But if there's going to be more money injected into the business, if there's going to be more investment, energy, whatever it might be to take the business forward, you need to understand what's motivating the shareholders because that's where it's going to come from. From a director perspective, who's the board? Now, if you're on the board of a regional, do you understand who you're reporting to? Do you understand, most importantly, what are the responsibilities of a director in your local country? Because you, as the registered director in that local country, are legally liable for whatever happens in that local country. And all too often, and I've been here as well, I used to work for a large software company. We had a parent from the US. We had a head of our division that was based in the UK. We had two development and consulting divisions, one in Australia and one in South Africa. And I was a director in South Africa. So I'd filled in the form. I'd been called a director. It looked really good on my business card, and I could apply for provisional tax, and I thought that was really cool. But I actually had zero idea about what risks that put me into in my personal capacity, in terms of my family wealth and family investments and savings and all the rest of it, and whether I could go and possibly could end up in court for something that I'd done wrong that I wasn't even aware of that I should have been monitoring in the first place. Now, that was probably okay 20 years ago. You could get away with a lot of those kind of things then, but now it's much more difficult. Now there's much more scrutiny on what everybody's doing throughout the supply chain. And if we're taking shortcuts in our home country and that gets picked up, we are liable in our home country, regardless of what the parent company told us to do. It's up to us to know, what does the law say? What are our roles and responsibilities? And what are we legally liable for in our place of operations? And all too often, the big daddy, wherever they're coming from, operates from a different rule book. They've potentially got different governance rules. They've got different Companies Act rules, and they may or may not be aware of those differences. So it's critical that we understand in the role of directors of where we are, what are all of the laws and all of the impacts on our country of abode, our country of operations, not just take the instructions from above and then implement them. And then making sure we have a distinction between our director hats and our manager hats. So the reason why those lines between the shareholder and the board is that the shareholder should not be meddling with the board. Another reason why it's important to understand who the shareholder is and start to push for that separation between shareholders and the board if you have that opportunity. Board, understand what your roles and responsibilities are as a board, and if you can get some kind of independent voice in that room, it just helps the conversation so much more, because you've got a focus on doing what that board needs to do rather than getting sucked into the operations because you're all managers in the room, or sucked into some other kind of conversation because in your organizational setup, you're all shareholders as well. So that's one of the key values of bringing independence in. It focuses the conversation in that segment, in that context, in that context that we're talking about what our responsibilities are as a director and not operations. And each of us have a relationship with the company in these contexts. And what makes it even more complicated is the shareholder tends to have a selfish relationship. They've put some money, they've put some time into the company, now they expect a return. So we see that where the parent company is possibly pushing for us to declare more of our profits as a dividend than is actually sustainable from an organizational perspective locally. We need to hold on to more of our cash because we're not going to get grants and funding and support from the government in terms of COVID. We need to hold on to some more stuff. But they're pushing to get their returns up so that their share price looks good. You need to fight that fight because you need to do everything you possibly can in the best interest of the company if you're in that director space. It's a selfless relationship. You cannot put yourself first. And management is very complicated by the fact that you've got a contract. So in the contract context, it's selfless because you have to deliver on the contract. You have to do your job as it's been defined, perform your role as it's been defined. But very often operational staff members, employees, team members become a lot more selfish when their salary is not paid or when there's some kind of problem with their bonus, etc. So it's a two-way street. Sometimes it's selfless, sometimes it's a little bit more selfish. Now, if you're wearing all three of those hats, which is very common in an entrepreneurial setup, that's really difficult to manage. So it's trying to separate these out by having different teams, different places where you meet, whatever it might be, and a clear understanding of which hat you're wearing when. And are you making a decision in the right way for the hat and the circumstance that you find yourself in? So what I would suggest, as particularly in a larger organization, find out and know who the shareholders are and what the shareholders want. And even in a smaller organization, even if you are the shareholder manager, understand what you and if you have other shareholders really want. Have you drawn up a shareholder statement of intent? Have you as a board got some kind of document that declares that intent? What is their expectation in terms of return? What is their expectation in terms of growth of value of the business? What kinds of business lines you can and can't go into, etc. Know who the directors are. If you're not part of that director group, make sure you understand who they are and what motivates them as far as possible, and learn a bit more about their role and responsibilities, because that's part of how you will support them better. If you have a clear understanding of what they're trying to achieve, then you can be much better about giving them the information that they need when they need it. So know who the management team is. So if you are at lower in the organization, then who's the management team? And if you are higher in the organization, probably even more important to understand who is the management team and learn about their roles and responsibilities. So that comes back to that, having a broader understanding of the different context, or of all of the different members of the organization. So it comes down to educate yourself in your craft, in your specific technical specialization. Make sure that you have learned as much as you possibly can, have sufficient qualifications in that space you possibly can. In the business in general, so if you want to move up through the layers of the organization, then you need to have a much broader understanding about how the whole machine works. Otherwise, you can't really have the same kind of impact and involvement in the strategic conversations if you don't. And clearly, the space is moving fast where you need to understand how governance works and how directorship works. And again, whether you are already a director or not, it's really key to start that journey, because it's not a quick thing. There's a lot to learn. It takes practice. It takes repeated implementation, learn, self-reflection, implement again, self-reflection. There's a reason why our applied directorship program is 11 months. We want you to have a learning experience, do a self-reflection, learn from it, repeat and go through that loop several times before you really build that new habit, you build that new muscle. And then what I suggest you start with is a clear understanding of self. So before you go on this journey of finding out about directorship and all these other things, make a decision. Am I best suited to be a technician? Am I best suited to follow a path which is based on that sort of craft kind of mindset? That's where I excel. That's where I get the most satisfaction of doing a really good job in my technical space. Then do that, own that. Don't think about the fact that you wanted at some point to be a directorship. Directorship is not a promotion. It's a different role. And you need to be able to fulfill that different role. It requires different skills, requires different ways of thinking. Manager. I'm really good at being a manager. I don't want to necessarily be focused on a technician. It got me up to a point, but I want to be a little bit more involved in management. I find working with a team challenging and interesting and exciting, and I want to learn more about how to do that. Then step into that space. Do an MBA, do some courses, do a diploma, read lots of books, watch lots of YouTube videos, do whatever you have to do to learn to be a better manager. And then the shift is, I've got the basic, thorough understanding of how business works. Do I have that strategic mindset? Can I step back and look at a problem from a distance and understand strategically how to move forward? Because then you're more likely to be an effective director. Then actively pursue that space. Where we go wrong all too often in organizations is we promote technicians too far, they become managers. They're not good at being managers. Promote managers to be directors and they're not good at being directors. We need to make sure that everybody's in their place and then encourage them, rewarded and trained to be the best they can be in their particular roles. And if this whole corporate thing is not for you, well, then become an entrepreneur. And then you have to do everything anyway. So what is the role of a director? Maybe just pop something in the chat. There's 3 things that really fall into this role of a director. We've talked about all of them, so it's not like I've hidden this from you. Yes, the presentation will be shared afterwards. Thanks, Leanne. We'll also be sharing the video of the presentation as well. So any guesses? Any guesses? Ensuring corporate governance. Yes, absolutely. Governance is one of those 3. Very much so. Very much so. And then we've touched on advisory. Well, what would advisory look like if you're sitting in a boardroom? What are you advising on? What do you own? What is a key part of the role? What is one of your key responsibilities? I'll put you out of sight. Financial responsibility. Yes, absolutely. Keeping a bird's eye view on the business is going, which is called strategy. So we are doing strategic advisory, but we are owning strategy. So as a director, often there's this misconception that the CEO owns strategy and the board just sort of reviews it and rubber stamps it and off we go. The board must debate it. The board must own it. And that's another reason why it's really critical. And so often this isn't the case with charities, and it blows my mind why. We need to make sure the MD or CEO is in the boardroom, because they need to buy into this strategy so they can provide input, very valuable input in terms of what are the capacities are of the operations, what are they seeing in the operations, what are the opportunities they're seeing in operations, but they must be part of the ownership of the strategy so that when it's implemented, the CEO says, yep, I agreed with that, I'm now going to implement it. Not this breakup of, no, but I voted against that, that wasn't what I thought, and it's not going to get any traction. It's just going to be bunch of really nice stuff on a piece of paper that no one's actually going to do anything with. So own the strategy as a director. Then be a leader. Lead by example. Lead by action. And that's really critical in the governance space, which is the 3rd part, Because if you're not leading as a director and implementing governance in the way that it's supposed to be implemented, according to best practice, according to all of the different guidelines that are now out there, then how's the organization going to know what is expected of them? And how are you going to hold the rest of the organization accountable if you're not doing it yourself? And then the governance part is about policies and procedures. That's what governance is really about. That's how, as a board, you implement governance in the rest of the organization. You determine what is the way we do things around here. You write it down. You make sure it's trained throughout the organization where appropriate and that people actually follow it. So you've got monitoring loops based on when did we last revise it, who's actually implementing it, when did we last revise it, who's actually implementing, so that we start getting better and better and better at all of these different things. And this whole loop of putting things in place, having a procedure, monitoring, measuring, reporting back to the board is absolutely part of this whole move towards integrated reporting. If we don't measure the value that we're generating across the different areas of the business, and we're not monitoring on a regular basis against what we said was our objective, then we can't possibly implement effective strategy, and we're probably going to miss something important. So our description of a high performance director is one who's obsessed with creating meaningful economic impact, and social is coming much more into it as well, through their role on the board and the role their company plays in the economy. Furthermore, and this is really critical, such a director is not afraid to have the tough conversations. So if you've got a dominant CEO, you've got a dominant shareholder in the boardroom, then it's much, much more difficult to have those tough conversations. So as a director, you need to have the skill, you need to have the EQ, but you also need to have the experience of how to handle those situations. How do you talk someone around? How do you bring another perspective to bear so that they can start to see that maybe that's not such a good idea? All of those things are critical learnings that you need to develop as part of being an effective and high performance director. So it's that obsession. I need to focus on what's in the best interest for the company. I need to focus on generating and creating value with this company. It's not just value to shareholders, it's value to everybody. Have our team got better and better working conditions over time? Are we training them more effectively? Are we giving them opportunities that we couldn't give them before? What's happening with our suppliers? Are we a really good client to those suppliers? How are we giving them feedback? How are we helping and support them so that their supply chain becomes better governed and better managed and more efficient? How are we working with our clients and various other stakeholders to make sure that we are creating that meaningful economic and social impact? And where are we having those tough conversations, and where aren't we having those tough conversations that we should be? And the piece that often is forgotten is those mundane aspects. Have we prepared for the meeting? Have we drawn up an agenda? Have we actually put some kind of papers together that we've thought about before we go into the meeting? Or is it just a verbal feedback or a couple of slides that we're presenting in the session, but we haven't really given everyone a chance to digest it before we go into that conversation and that meeting? So what are your legal duties? So it really starts fundamentally with care, skill, and diligence. So it's your approach to decision making. And one of the things it mentions in the Companies Act, it's like the relationship between a father and a child is what you should be in the space of as a leader and a director in your business related with the organizations. The organization is a juristic person. It is that child that you need to care for. And it's father versus mother because it's much more of a challenging. It's an accountability. It's giving them guidance on where to take the business forward. It's giving them guidance on what is an appropriate way of doing things. What is the value system that we have in this family, in this business? How do we make sure that we're training those individuals to be effective leaders? Are we giving them the right education? Are we, in a family context, sending them to the right schools, etc.? Are we giving them exposure to networks? Are we bringing them into our work groups or our friend groups to try and help them get mentored and see and experience other people that are doing things in a particular way so they can get guidance from them? Some of the most successful entrepreneurs may well have not necessarily had really good upbringings, but they found a mentor somewhere along the way. They found a coach that's helped and supported them. So how in the organization are we mentoring, and how with that father kind of hat on, are we doing it generally in our lives? Because the more we do it outside work, the easier it is to do it inside work. Have we got the commercial acumen we need to be a truly effective director? Are we doing self-development? Are we reading regularly? Are we in courses regularly, etc., etc.? And then when we go into those sessions, have we prepared properly? Are we paying attention to the detail? Are we reading the financials? Or are we just sticking because the CFO said so, then it must be right? And we end up like Steinhoff. So there's much more emphasis now on not just what we do, but what we do and how we do it. What is that logistics chain, that supply chain, the whole process from resources coming in, whether it's money or products coming into our business and flowing through the business and coming out as an output. It's not just about the output anymore. There's much more scrutiny on everything that happens in between. And you can see that with the ESG, you can see that with integrated reporting, you can see that with the stakeholder inclusivity focus now on all of the upcoming and recently announced governance frameworks. It's about principles. It's about doing the right thing and getting the benefit as a result. The other part of it, so taking that care, skill, and diligence and applying it to the fiduciary duties, which is act in good faith. So always acting in good faith towards the company, you need to have the right necessary skill and care in performing your duties in order to do that. Act in the best interest of the company, so avoiding conflicts of interest, making sure that you're not, as is happening in far too many state enterprises, it's very much about personal interest. So how do we make sure that we are avoiding that personal interest? If there's a conflict, we hand the decision to someone else, we leave the room, whatever's needed to make sure that we're not potentially conflicted and not using our positions for personal gain or accessing the powers that weren't actually given to us in the first place. So what is the executive director's role? Day-to-day management of the company or a salaried employee. Intimate understanding of the business. This is what you bring to the table when you walk into a boardroom. So preparing for your first board meeting, preparing for any board meeting, is making sure that the information you're bringing to the table, the board papers you're delivering to the table, are complete, they're accurate, and making sure that you're not hiding things that are important in terms of strategy and decision making. So that information in balance. You know more about how the operations work because you're operating in the business. How is a non-exec director supposed to find that out unless you tell them, unless you give them something to read to bring them up to speed? So you're entrusted to ensure the papers presented to the board is an accurate reflection of what's going on. But always balance that management hat of what is in the best interest of the company, not in the best interest of you or in your department, etc. So that's where that conflict starts to take place if you're wearing both hats. In the room as a director, I've got to think about what's in the best interest of the business. And then when I leave the room, I've got to try and work out how to implement it. If there are fundamental flaws in the thinking, then speak up in the room. If it's not said in the room, then you can't bring it up later. Independent director, key role because they don't represent a shareholder. They may have possibly a very small indirect interest, but if it's material in the slightest way, so the guideline is 5% of someone's net worth, but better to not be a shareholder, not represent a shareholder at all. Tricky when you've got the shareholder appointments, so it's key that you have some kind of space in the middle. You've got some kind of director appointment committee where someone's put forward by the shareholder, but as soon as they're appointed, they are doing everything in the company's best interest, not just the shareholder, which means that it's quite a tricky conversation when the shareholder is expecting someone on the board to report back every 10 minutes about what went on. You can't do that because that knowledge is not necessarily relevant and it may be confidential and it shouldn't be shared with the shareholders. It should be done via a report that goes to all shareholders, and it should be excluding the confidential parts about how you made a decision, etc., etc. You may want to report a summary, but it's not the nitty-gritty of who said what and when and who and how, all of those kind of things. An high performance board is one that through its rhythm and decision making holds the company accountable. So this is the critical part. If you want to be a director, you need to be prepared to do this. You need to be prepared to hold the company accountable to a performance standard higher than it's ever had before. What helps is thinking about diversity. So diversity is critical. And what I'm talking about here is, this is Ashby's law of requisite variety. And he talks about making sure that you've got enough variety so that you can cover all the different states of existence in your organization, the variety of things that can happen in the organization. Now, you can put systems in place. You can put IT systems and other physical systems and paper trails and whatever to control some of it. But there will be a lot of other stuff that happens in the business. If we haven't learned that in the last two and a half years, then I'm not sure when we ever will, where you need to have people in the room who have different experiences. And that's what we're talking about diversity. So what this lady said, which I thought was brilliant, was it's too cozy. Often boards are very cozy. They're the golf club board. They're very chummy. They've known each other for years. They studied together. They studied the same subjects. They've broadly seen eye to eye in everything. And what's interesting, and this is not just a white male thing. It's potentially a Jewish male thing, a Christian male thing, an Indian male thing. It could be even so much if the board is all female, though it's far less common. We definitely need to move in that space, but right now it's far less common. It just means that if there's a group of people sitting around the table who think like each other, whose life experience is similar, then they're going to miss stuff. They're not going to see what's happening in vast portions of the countries that we all live in. If we've gone to the best schools, we're not going to understand what's going on in the townships. We're not going to understand how our products and service could affect those people in the lower LSMs, because we just don't get it. We've never been there. We've never lived like that. So we have to bring more diversity into the board in terms of, we have to have more female on the board because their perspective is different. And it's an importantly different perspective. We have to have younger people on the board as well as older people on the board because the perspectives are different. And we need to have a variety of cultures that are relevant to our particular country, if and as far as possible. This is not supposed to be like the Social and Ethics Committee that has everybody in it. We need to at least make sure that we have a board that's is representative of our ultimate clients as far as possible, so that we understand their needs, we understand their issues, we understand how we can do a better job. But it doesn't work if everybody's from the same background, same schools, study the same subjects, they're all accountants, they're all lawyers, they're whatever it might be. It just doesn't work. So the stronger we can make the directors, the stronger we can make the boardroom, the better we apply a particular methodology, then we can move and shift the needle. We can really make a difference to company performance. Very, very quickly, ISO 37000, if you haven't heard, is the new international standard. And what makes it so different is because it's been recognized by everybody that's involved in ISO standard. And it brings together so many of the other standards. So King 4 is a major contributor to this. It was also Professor King and Carolyn Chalmers was part of developing the ISO 37000 standard. So we have a very good voice from South Africa in making this, putting this thing together. And I gather they've been working on it for a number of years. It was released at the end of last year. But the important thing is, this is the first international governance standard. It brings all of the best work that have been done in multiple countries and jurisdictions and brings it all together in one practice-based setup. And this is what it looks like. So it leads from outside in. What is our perspective outside in? So responsible stewardship, ethical behavior, effective performance. And then you get to the core. What is the purpose of your organization? How does it generate value? What is the strategy that we have in place to help and support generating value? What is the oversight we have as an organization to make sure that the strategy is being delivered? What is the accountability that we've built into the organizational structure to make sure things get done? And then you move out through stakeholder engagement, making sure you develop leadership, data and decisions, risk, governance, social responsibility, and viability of performance over time. So all of these things are now coming together. This stakeholder inclusivity is now properly mainstream, and finally it's international. So the key points, the level of agreement and the scope of application was immense. So 100% agreement from the ISO participants, which is over 70 countries, from organizations of all sizes. So this is not just a corporate thing anymore. It applies to all businesses. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. This is not a tick box governance exercise. This is like King 4. This is apply and explain. This is the best practice. Now apply it and explain if you applied it and how you applied it, but also explain if you didn't apply it and why. We want to know. Purpose is at the core. So what is the purpose of the organization? How does it generate value? And the why determines what we do. Value generation, very, very key focus now. The reporting systems that are now, the frameworks and standards that are coming out are very much more about determining and presenting how you generate value, and also thinking about if you generate value in one area, there's often a conflict with another area where you can't generate as much value. And there's a sort of to and fro between the two. So that's why it's important to apply and explain. So we've focused on generating value here. We understand that there's a compromise because we're not going to be able to do such a good job here, but we're going to try and mitigate that and make sure the impact is as low as possible. Whether that impact is social, environmental, whatever, this is how we're going to mitigate that as far as possible because we are focusing on generating value over here. But you've thought about it. You've made some decisions that have tried to control the risk as much as possible. So it's outcomes based. The proof of the governance is in the output, is in the eating. And your system is perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes you're getting, so you may well need to fundamentally change your system, fundamentally change the way you've implemented governance to make sure that it fills the gaps. Just to really show that yes, they've both ended up in circles, but on the left is our governance compass that we've been running with for the last 10 years. The main difference is all of the elements are covered in both, but the main difference is they've taken the outside-in approach and started with the outside as their sort of shell that is working with the outside world, and then how do you build the organization and make sure that it achieves and delivers according to that expectation from the outcome. We've worked much more on a flow basis because this links with our contribution compass model, and we understand in our model there are the four forces that pulling in opposite directions. Purpose is there, sustainability is there, but they pull in opposite directions. Performance and conformist tend to pull in opposite directions. And if we flow around the circle, then we start with strategy and direction. We need to make sure we've got the right organizational culture to implement that strategy. We've got the right leadership who are following the right culture to implement the strategy. And so you go around the wheel. So it builds momentum. So theirs is an outside in and inside out, whereas we've looked much more as a flow. So purpose is there, strategy is there, organizational culture. You can find links with all of the different segments as you go. So as I said, ours starts with strategy and direction, then moves around to making sure you've identified your organizational culture and understand what it needs to be in order to deliver on the strategy. You've got the right leadership based on the right values, that you're recruiting against those values, etc. Now you've determined them, and you move through into now looking outwards. Have our stakeholders got the right values? Are we engaging with them in the right way? Are we demonstrating our purpose to all our different stakeholders? And around you go around the wheel. And this is how it links to the contribution compass. The two are overlaid. So if a particular personality profile on this system, the catalyst is good at doing strategy and direction. They tend to think from a distance. They look down from above. Sustaining custodians is much more about understanding the operations, understanding how the processes are working, whether they're effective, do we need to change them or not, etc. So wrap up, it's really, really critical that you understand how these three hats of shareholder, director, and manager work, which one you want to wear, which one you are wearing, when are you wearing it, how are you wearing it, are you taking decisions with the wrong hat, are you sitting in a board meeting and you're taking decisions based on your manager hat or your shareholder hat. Understand them, understand the distinctions between them, and get into the habit of holding each other accountable. If you're in a board meeting and one of the other hats comes up, so that's very operational, we need to talk about that at Exco. That's actually a shareholder decision. That needs to go back to the shareholders for them to draw up a resolution. Push it back to where it belongs, because it takes away the emphasis on what you should be doing as a director and looking at strategy, leadership, and governance. International standards have arrived. ISO 37000 is the first, there will probably be others. We need to understand that they apply to everybody now. So we can't just, because we're not listed, we're a large corporate, then we don't need to do it. Just because we're a large private company, we're not a corporate, we don't need to do it. It applies to everybody all the way down. So banks will start asking for this stuff. How have you applied and explain your application of governance rules? Banks are going to be looking for it, investors are already looking for it, etc., etc. So it really doesn't matter how big an organization is. We need to start thinking about implementing governance, at least at rudimentary level, so that we can demonstrate with board minutes. Even if you only have a board meeting 4 times a year and it's 1-page minutes, these are the decisions we made, and sign them. So that if anybody asks, anyone needs to look at it, they can understand what's going on in your organization, how the money is moving around. Understand the role of director and your responsibilities. Before entering the boardroom, do the training, read up. Don't walk into the room and expect to learn to be a director there. Already have learned to be a director before you walk into the room. Demonstrate strategic thinking and leadership, absolutely critical if you're in the boardroom. If you cannot think strategically, then really think twice about whether you want to be in the boardroom. Why do you want to be in the boardroom? Is it a false understanding of what the responsibility is actually all about? And implement governance properly and apply it with care, skill, and diligence. The law will be looking out and checking you against, did you apply care? Did you apply skill? Did you apply diligence? That's the measure that they're going to be using. And ensure that all 8 areas of the governance compass are covered off. Have you got a strategy? Have you thought about your culture? Have you thought about how you recruit and how you develop leadership? Have you got all of the other elements of the 8 areas of the governance compass, not just the risk and compliance part and possibly financials? So education opportunities, the last 5 minutes. If you've got any questions, put them up on the Q&A, put them in the chat box. See, how do we ensure that there is diverse inclusion with the various boards? So have you got a director appointment committee? That's one way of making sure that you've got some kind of rules around how you bring in diversity. Have you got a plan? Have you got a strategy around it? Are you training up people from internally? Are you actively looking for people externally? It's part of the strategy. Diversity is not a, we'll do it tomorrow. It's what is appropriate for our organization. What makes sense in terms of skills, in terms of attitude and aptitude and values fit, in terms of profile. So have we thought about this board in it as a whole? Have we got the right people with the right profile who are going to think differently? That's an element of diversity. Have we got a good values fit? Do we need to have a bit of diversity in terms of the way people approach things? Because that causes a bit of conflict and makes us actually think things through and not take things for granted. Is that valuable? Do we need to do that? And if so, how? And then what are the key skills we need to have in the boardroom? If we've got a whole bunch of CAs in the boardroom, maybe we should thin that out and bring in some other people from other areas, maybe someone with marketing skills, or someone who's got skills taking businesses into other countries, etc. So it all should be part of your strategy to develop and build diversity. I hope that answered your question, Doreen. Representing the interests of the company, ESG report, ESG role. Excuse me. So there are much more rules about ESG and guidelines than are listed in corporate space. But I think the integrated reporting is taking us in a direction which basically means that if we apply those kinds of rules, those kinds of standards, then we're going to satisfy a lot of the ESG stuff, but actually we're going to be satisfying the overall understanding of how governance works and principles work and what we should be doing as organizations anyway. Because the ESG tends to be very focused on what's current right now, whereas if you look at integrated reporting and dig into it, I did a webinar on it last week. If you want to look on our YouTube channel, you can watch it there. It's much broader and it's much longer term. So it's looking much further forward in its concept and its the way it's structured. And I think that's the right thing to do. Any other questions? Any other questions? So as I said, we've got a one-day workshop on ISO 37000 coming up on the 4th of May if you'd like to find out a little bit more about it. We've got a one-day, what we call the high performance boards workshop, where we go through the 3 hats, we go through board process in a lot more detail. In other words, we build the foundations of what it means to be a director in the course of that day. The 11-month program is taking what we just touch on at very high level in the one-day workshop and then spreading it out over an incredibly comprehensive 11-month program. You have a workshop and a facilitated session, a board meeting once a month. So it's 4 hours. So we try to make it look and feel like you're on the board of directors. So you're put into teams, you form a board, you have a simulated company that you run, and you meet once a month to have your board meeting. And then we have some facilitated conversation on the particular theme of that month as at the same time. Everything else is in your own time, online, read it, watch the video, do all of the other exercises you need to do in your own time. Again, as if you were on a board. How are you going to fit it in with your rest of your life? How are you going to fit it in with your other business interests and responsibilities, etc.? So interesting, I only realized this after I put up this slide, but practically everybody on these high performance board workshop testimonials have ultimately moved on and done the applied directorship program. So Jennifer signed up recently. I think she started in March. Lisa started last year. I think might have just finished her training. And Eugene is a small architectural firm, and I think his focus was much more on about having run his business for 30 years based on instinct, and now suddenly realizing he needed to have some structure before he could do proper succession planning. And Motsile also did the high performance board workshop and has now doing the applied directorship program. And their board has been transformed. They've done a lot of our training programs, and the Kagori Capital have overcome some difficult situations and governance issues in the process, and are now really starting to thrive and move forward. And Christos Urasis, I happen to serve on his board, a really great company, but really needed the board structure to take them forward. Son inherited from father, and father passed away, and now all the responsibility for this large organization was on his shoulders. And I think taking the weight off those shoulders, at least partially, by having the board in place really helped, especially during COVID. So that he's done the applied directorship program and testimonial. So one particular one I saw that stood out was, from having no board experience, I believe I have gained the basic and deep experience and knowledge of what values are required from a board member. It's helped me to identify what areas lacking in our board and our company as a whole. And I truly hope that that's the value you get out of doing some kind of training program, that you can't start to see what the gaps are, what the issues are, and then you have a choice. Do I stay in and become part of the solution, or do I get out because it's too big for me and I need to find another space to operate? But at least you can make that choice. And what drives me and what drives Serdar, and I think is my closing phrase really, is good directors grow companies, great directors change lives. You have the potential, you have the responsibility to impact so many stakeholders, stakeholder inclusivity. If we can do the right thing for all of those people and companies that we have influence over, we can fundamentally change lives. If you think about, if we make the right decision and we survive through a crisis because we made the right decision, we got the advice we needed, we have the right leadership, versus going off and doing what we did before and suddenly the business is gone. Just think of the impact of losing all of those jobs, all of that revenue, the communities that are impacted, the suppliers, the clients, everyone that's impacted by that company going into liquidation. If we can do a better job than we did before, then we can potentially impact lives as well. So it's not just by stopping the business from failing. If we grow the business to its full potential, we can impact massive numbers of lives. So think about that and see if you can work out where and how you do that. So thank you very much. Please just put the poll up, Jenny, for the follow-ups if anybody wants any more information. I'm also happy to do a 30-minute consult if anybody's interested. No charge, just get on the call and talk about your situation and maybe hopefully mentor you and give you some advice on what next steps might look like. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry for going a couple of minutes over. And I wish you all the best for a fabulous day, fabulous rest of the week. Enjoy your public holiday tomorrow. And yes, look forward to seeing whoever on one of our courses. And let's see how we can help you and support you to be the best director you can be in whatever organization you end up in. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for spending your time with me. and let's see if we can help and support you to take the next step. So please, yes, just tick the box, even if it's just thank you for the presentation. It's always good to get the feedback. And we'll be doing more webinars. They've got one coming up, I think, in a couple of weeks. I think we're moving towards a space where we'll be doing at least 2 a month. So look out for it. Sign up for our newsletters if you're not already. Those of you who went through an affiliate, and Gordon, if you can help your people who've come on the call to get onto the newsletters, they get notice of any future events. Then we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. I'll just leave that for a couple more seconds. I think there are a few people. Great. Thank you very much. Cheers and bye for now.